to the game. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the game education track of FDG20. We have a collection. We have a couple of papers and short paper. We'll be starting with a video presentation, first paper, but the lead author is available in the chat and we'll be taking questions and providing answers, obviously. After that, we have a couple full papers. This track isn't that full, so I won't be as strict with time as I might otherwise be. And hopefully we'll have a lot of really interesting discussion. So that being said, let's hear from our first paper, Digital Games and the Emergence of Problem-Solving Processes, a case study with preschool children, by Caterina Morfonio, Guido Bulgari, Maria Sfioeda, and Dimitrios Goskos.
Caterina Morfonio, and I will present you our study, which is about digital games and the emergence of problem-solving processes on preschool. So, in this research, we examined problem-solving processes that children followed in two different conditions. There are individuals and team game players. And now, our main research question is whether and what problem-solving processes are observed in individual and in team game playing conditions. We did an extensive research on the field of problem-solving processes on preschool. We found and we focused on literature on problem-solving processes and on Becker's and Britz's findings. Then we tried to focus on research on preschool children, which is about digital games and problem-solving processes. However, we noticed that there are few research about this field. So we approached the issue by following the qualitative methodology and more specifically, a case study. We collected data from video screen recordings, while in the same time we recorded children's comments and behavior. Later, we compared and matched them with screen recording in order to conduct our data to analyze. The whole procedure in school lasted approximately 1 month. We used tablets, but it was prohibited to take video and sound recording. So, for this reason, we take notes for children behavior and comments, as we have already said. But when they finished the game, we did short interviews in order to learn how much fun it was for them. 7 children, 6 years old, participated from 1 kindergarten. The selection was random and dependent on their availability during an after-school program. In order to show how they activated as individuals and as teammates, 3 of them played alone and 4 of them on pairs. The game we chose is called Inventioneers and is created by Filimundus. We chose this game because it was offered a free version for Android and iOS, and it allowed experimentation, discover learning, problem solving, analysis, and multiple solutions to a problem. Players have to use objects from the bottom bar and drag them on the workspace to create an invention and solve the problem. In order to analyze our data, we used this coding scheme, which is proposed by Becker and Britz research. They describe 5 steps of a problem-solving situation. First of all, problem identification, observation and collection of information, brainstorming, searching for a strategy, and assessment of a result. So, we matched the data we had from our case study to these processes, and now we will illustrate interesting examples from the processes which we found on our research. We noticed that in both conditions, children tried to identify the goal of the game. In later levels, when they felt familiar with this procedure, they began quickly to drag objects. On per condition, children used to ask, what do you think we should do? We also collected information for the second procedure. Initially, children used to use objects randomly when they felt familiar with this procedure, as we said in the previous stage. In both conditions, children seemed to focus on only objects. On per condition, children told each other, there are so many things there, we have to think where they fit. At the final levels, where children were more experienced to this procedure, they began to drag and put the familiar objects first, and then the newly ones. We continue with brainstorming. It was a stage which is particularly noticed in per condition. Children discussed about the function of the game. They identified each other's mistakes and corrected each other. Furthermore, they expressed their own thoughts and cooperate each other. Children in both conditions were building their strategies gradually as they were experimenting through trial and error with the affordances of game objects. Another strategy they followed was to use first familiar objects and then the newly ones. On pairs, children behaved in the same way. Also, we noticed that children would again discuss and ask each other, gave instructions each other, and corrected each other's mistakes. Lastly, children assess the whole procedure on both conditions by identifying the wrong and the correct, and by complaining for the difficulty of the game. The above examples prove that children followed the proposal scheme. So, in order to answer to our research question, this was a case study involving a small sample and with a specific game. Although findings cannot be generalized, the study allowed us to take a closer look at the gaming practices of young children with focus on problem-solving strategies. Children followed problem-solving processes. They did not use only trial and error for problem-solving, but they also cooperate and express their ideas, gave instructions each other, and solved the problem. The design of the game seemed to support the emergence of such cognitive processes. Different objects, difficulty between levels, opportunity for new inventions are the main characteristics of this game, which offer children the chance to experiment creatively, to reflect, infer, hypothesize, discuss, debate, and formulate strategies. Considering the widespread use of digital games by children, even before they reach preschool age, and the importance of the children's experiences during their first 5 years and of preschool education for their later life, it is imperative that further research and development focuses on games for this target group, which allow the emergence of higher order thinking skills such as critical thinking, inquiring, and problem solving. Thank you for your time.
Excellent. So I believe the speaker can answer questions. If anybody has them, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can also just type in the chat.
I can answer your questions.
Okay, waiting to see if anybody posts anything in the chat. So
I have a quick, okay, I don't know if you want to first.
Okay.
Okay.
No, go for it.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. I just wonder, so it's all to do with sort of like preschool age. Do you think any of that would generalize outside of preschool and into sort of maybe further or higher education as well?
I think that these findings is about only preschool, and our sample was only 7 children, so we can't generalize our findings.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
So let's Let's go with my question next. I don't see anybody else. Yeah. So you're looking at problem-solving strategies that the kindergarten kids were using with the games. And I'm wondering if you have any insight as to whether or not the kids already have certain strategies that they've developed specifically for games. So when it is a game, use these strategies instead of other problem-solving strategies they might apply more broadly.
When we started this procedure, I didn't give them instructions. I wanted to feel, I wanted them to feel free and follow the strategy they feel it was the right. So children experiment with the game and make their own choices. All the findings was their own effort.
Do you think maybe they approached it differently because they knew it was a game?
Can you repeat the question?
Do you think they approached it differently in their strategies because they knew it was a game?
Maybe yes, but when I think about what you said to me, it was finished my research.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Coming up next, we have asking students to do all the work, an analysis of a fully peer-assessed course on game design and development. The authors are Pierluca Lanzi and Daniele Loiacono. I don't know if
I'm here, Daniele.
Perfect. Daniele, excellent. So I think you can grab control of the screen and take it away.
Okay, let me do that. Okay. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Daniele Loiacono, and I'm presenting this work done with my colleague Pierluca Lanzi. I'm from Politecnico di Milano. So this work is basically to introduce you, to present you how we designed the video game design and development course, that is a course in the master in computer engineering at Politecnico di Milano that started in 2010. In this paper we discussed how we designed the course, because we basically when the course started, this was the first video game course at our university, and we have two major questions we had to solve in designing this course. And the first one is we want this course to be a project-based course, and so our major problems were how to select the project to be developed and how to evaluate the students' projects. So the reason that were behind our choices in the design were basically that we didn't want to have any bias on this process. We really want our students to engage in their project and be completely free to express their creativity. So and also our biggest fear was that our personal preferences in terms of game and game design could actually affect too much the selection process and the choices of the students. And also not forget to mention that we can basically, our other fear was to feel a bit disconnected by the latest trend, as we are not too young anymore. So the idea was basically completely give freedom to our students and let them in that way empower them with this freedom and leave them basically almost all the job. So let me explain what I mean with that. So the course is basically as a rather traditional organization. So we have the several stages during the course that are the stages of the project of the students. So there is the first part that is a game design stage, and the deliverable is basically a game concept that each student has to submit, and then there is a voting process to select which are the projects that are actually will be developed during the course. So every student has to submit a single concept or even more than one concept. I will go back on that later. And after that, each student has a given amount of vote, and then can select the best projects, the best concept according to his or her preferences. And the most voted one are actually chosen and developed during the class. Then there is a team building stage where the people presenting the course, the winning concept becomes team leader and has to form a team with the other students. Also, this stage, this step is left to the students. We just provide some support for people that is struggling to find a project, or for teams that are struggling to find other members to form the projects. Then we have a game design and development stage. After that, the first part of the development, the deliverable is basically a game design document, and we have a project review. Then we have the last part of the game development, the game design development, before the very first demo, that is the alpha demo, and then we have the last tint of development and the final deliverable, that is actually the beta of the project. So this is the organization, and for what concern instead the lectures, we have 8 days during the semester that are basically full day with this organization. So we have 2 hours of traditional lectures mainly about game design, and there are also some lecture on AI, or on special topics that might differ every year. And then we have a 1 hour invited talk, mainly from a small game company in Italy. And finally, we have in the afternoon, we have a technical workshop. The technical workshop can be on programming, or can be also on specific tools. The idea of the technical workshop was not to cover completely all the tools for the development needed for the development of the games, but just to give some sort of crash tutorial to the students, in order to help them with the initial stage of the development. And then of course they are required to go deeper than what they see during the workshop. But one benefit of this workshop is that also we also have design students in the class, so they are very useful also for the designer to see at least the very basic of the technical development, and so they can understand better how to interact with the developer. So just to explain a little more about the concept and the voting. So the concept, as I said, is something that each student has to propose. We started with just one concept for each student, but lately we moved in the last few years, we moved to another format. So we asked them to submit 2 different concepts. One is completely open, and the other one is restricted in the sense that they cannot have nor violence nor sex. The reason was mainly because we discovered that, not surprisingly, leaving out of the table both violence, any form of violence, not just graphic violence, but any kind of violence or sex, the students are really more forced to be more experimental, to really find something that is not as usual as you can have instead with the completely open concept. So for this reason, we created these two different tracks, and after the voting, we basically select the best among the open tracks and the best among the, let's say, experimental track. So the students has to read all the concepts that are shared to them anonymously, and they have one week, sorry, to select the best 15 according to their preferences. Once so they are ranked according to the preferences of the students, and the top one are selected, and then teams are formed, as I said before, basically using the form of the class or mailing list, or even with not this year, unfortunately, but usually with the meeting in person. So we had time for students to meet together and to know each other and just to find teammates. So these are examples, just to have you an idea of the concept. So the structure is pretty open. We give them suggestions on what should be in the concept, but we really don't have them to. We don't force them to have a very strict structure. So they can be pretty standard, pretty engineering-like concept, like the one on the left, or they can be more expressive, more creative, as the middle one and the one on the right. The second step, the second stage of the development of the project of the students is the game design document. So once the teams are formed, the students work toward the project review. The project review is done after they turn in their first version of the game design document. And this basically a moment we identified during the course to give them some early suggestion on their project. The reason of this was not to really impose them our view on their project, but mainly to help them discuss with them, to give them a first critical perspective on their ideas, but mainly to help them with not underestimate the complexity of their project, because what we discovered very soon was that most of the students tend to underestimate the complexity of the project they designed. The real heart of the project development, however, are the alpha and beta presentation that are basically the two moments. The first one is just before the winter holidays, and the last one, the beta, is after the winter holidays. And these two moments were moments where the students can present to all the to the class their projects. So we organize this sort of class meeting. They can organize themselves in areas of this room, and they basically has to showcase their project to the other students. So the students can go around and try the games of their colleagues and give them suggestion help them to identify criticalities, and also they have to evaluate the work of their peers. So the evaluation is basically done asking to each student to rank only only the games they tried. So at the end of the presentation day, they have a form to turn in with the ranking of the games they tried. The idea of ranking instead of giving an evaluation is that first we thought that ranking might be easier than actually provide an evaluation on a scale, and also allows us to compare easily the evaluation, because otherwise it might be difficult to weight the evaluation of different person. And finally, the ranking forced them to make a choice to actually select the game they like more and the game they like less. At the very end of the class, so after the project is done and the very final release, we also have an internal evaluation done in each team, where the students can give a feedback about the team members. And the reason of that is to identify any criticalities, like students that actually didn't contribute to the development of the project. And so this is not really to grade the students, is basically to identify problems. And so in this case, we might, for example, penalize or actually fail students if we identify that there were really issues with just one member of the team. About the grading, we gave to students to each project grade for each one of these activities. This is the share of the grade for each activity. But what is more interesting is how we actually grade, for example, the alpha and beta that was one of the problems I presented at the beginning. And so we use this ranking provided by the students. So the grade is actually provided by the students themselves. So all the class collectively define the ranking of the projects, and these rankings are used to grade each project. So what happens is that we collect the ranking for each one of the students that participate to the beta and alpha presentation, and we have to aggregate all these rankings. So to do that, we compute two metrics. The first one is basically the median normalized rank of the project, normalized because not all the students tries all the games, so we had to normalize the rank between 0 and 1. Otherwise, we can't compare ranking with the different number of games. And the other things we use is the modified board account. That is another metrics that is used to rank to deal with ranking. So based on this, we do an analysis of the projects, and we assign a grade to the students. We typically assign the 100% of the score for each activity to project that achieved that are in the top group according to this metric, and we assign only the 60% of the grade of the score to the point that are in the lowest group. let me show you with an example to clarify this that is probably otherwise difficult to explain. In this example, for example, you see an example of 1 year. We had, in this case, 19 games represented as G01 to G19. And for each one, we computed this normalized rank. The lowest is the better. The lower the better, and the modified board account that instead is the opposite, the higher the better. So in this case, we do this knee-elbow analysis of this metric of the normalized ranking, and we are able to identify groups of games that has had similar performances. So in this case, we had these groups, and we assign the top of the grade, the whole point to the top group. In this case, for example, we had this outlier that was a game extremely considered by the peers extremely better than the others, and so we decided to give to this project actually more than 100% of the points for that for this activity. And then we start giving 100% to this point, and less and less and less toward 60%. Of course, in the event that actually fortunately happened only twice so far, that one group failed to present the project, so fail completely the activity, it will receive no point. But basically, with each choice, we give 60% if the group is able to provide a deliverable.
Daniele, sorry to interrupt, but we need to start wrapping up soon, please.
Okay, yeah, sure. So just to wrapping up, we received a lot of students' feedback in the past. So these are quickly the feedback we received by the student, and the major criticalities we received was about the load of work was perceived, the workload of the course was perceived too high. And another criticalities we had was that some project struggling in the first stage. So in this year, we started introducing the early project review I discussed it before, and this lead to some improvements to the students' feedback. So just to conclude, let me go to skip to the end. I had just an example. We had several, sorry. Okay. So just to conclude, we had this strange organization. We, at the very beginning, were extremely scared about giving students all this power on the process, but it turns out that actually this really engaged and responsibilized the students, and really created very little troubles during the years. So we are pretty happy with the result of this process, although we still are in search for a way to improve this process. That's basically it. I'm happy to answer any question, and in the meanwhile, I probably show you some video of these, but without audio, of some project presented in the past.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your presentation, for the papers. Very, very interesting. I wonder if anybody has any questions. We probably have 1 or 2 minutes to handle that. Trying to leave some time at the end of the session so that we can have questions for any of the presenters.
I have a question. So yeah, it was a very interesting talk. I just wonder, I'm not sure if I was completely getting it, but you mentioned that the lower groups got 60% and then the higher groups got 100. So I'm just wondering how did you establish the cutoff score of 60%, and what's the reason for not going lower than that?
So basically, the idea is that if you don't fail the deliverables, it means that we believe that the groups deserve to actually pass the exam. If we go lower than 60%, it means that the group, even respecting the deliverable and producing a project and working prototype and beta, is not passing, is failing the exam. So that was the idea of the cutoff. It happened, but it was really a fail in presenting a deliverable. So in that case, we gave 0 point, but was specific cases.
Thank you very much.
On that note, could you comment on whether or not the class culture or community suffers from that? Because essentially the grading system is a competitive system where you're guaranteeing that a certain number of students are going to get a lower grade than everybody else, even if everyone did amazing work, just because of the nature of the ranking. So does that lead to more competitiveness and less collaboration between the students or the teams, or does it just sort of work out okay?
No, so far it worked out pretty okay. Of course, it created, I would say, rather than there is competitiveness, but rather than really negative, a negative mood in the class, like people not helping each other in different groups. What we observed is that people really identified with their game and their projects. So we found unexpected things like students actually producing some, I would say, sort of merchandising of the game for the presentation, like T-shirts or some things with the logo of the games. And this was something unexpected, because we never experienced so much involvement in a project work before in our experience.
Interesting. Okay, thank you very much. We'll now proceed for our third presentation, teaching students how to make games for research creation, meaningful impact. The paper authors are Mia Consalvo and Andy Phelps.
Okay.
Andy's going to share his screen.
Sorry. I have to do something. So
You have to stop sharing your screen.
Should be good now.
Yep.
Let's see. Yep. Okay. Yeah. So I'm Andy. That's Mia. We're going to talk today about teaching students how to make games for research creation and meaningful impact. And our subtitle to the whole thing is "It's really hard." Okay. Okay. There. So the emerging themes that I kind of wanted to frame this with is when we talk about research creation. So we're talking about advancing research broadly defined through the act of making games, using games as tools for doing research, and then also creatively presenting research topics and findings through games. So there's a couple of different themes in there, but when you look at the literature around research creation and around meaning and impact in using different media, these things are starting to bubble up as being very prominent in the field. And what I would say is that there's a lot of background research from other fields around research creation, around dissemination and meeting literature that we are not going to talk about today. We're instead going to say, go read the paper, because the introduction and first section of the paper is basically linking all the groundwork from other fields about the kinds of things that we were interested in. And the way that this came about is that unbeknownst to either of us, last year we taught some courses, and it turns out that they were actually very similar courses. They weren't necessarily designed to be that way, but Mia was teaching at Concordia, I was teaching at American, and we discovered a bunch of similarities around what we were doing and the kinds of experiences and problems that we were having in the courses. So Mia's course was a mixture of MA and PhD students, mostly not game production focused students. They're engaged in their research topics with wildly different forms and levels of academic and gameplay experience. So some of them had built some games before, some of them hadn't, etc. My course at American was mostly MA and MFA students. They're in game design or games and interactive media programs, so they're more engaged in game production. And the course is a lead-in to prepare them for their capstone experience, which played heavily in how it was organized. And then most students in our games program or related things like in interactive games and media, so they were mostly majors. But some of them had not a lot of prior production experience. Most of the courses that they'd taken up to that point were sort of either more skill building courses or raw design theory courses. And this was their first like put it into practice sort of larger experience. So we'll start with Mia talking about our course.
Thanks. And if you hear weird noises, I have a work crew 4 feet outside my window building a fence, and I have 2 dogs in here, so there could be some chaos that ensues. So my course, I really began with 2 central questions. What exactly is research creation for games? I mean, research creation, as Andy mentioned, is a broad topic. Other people refer to it as critical making or arts-based research, but people like Rilla, Khaled, and Pippin Bar have also explored this, but I wanted to tackle it through a course, and also how can it be evaluated? How do we know what's good? And for the class itself, there were a number of assignments, but overall, I wanted the students to create 3 prototypes, 1 physical, 1 digital, and the games could iterate on each other, build as they went along, or they could be totally separate. Next slide. So, I mean, the students overall were very enthusiastic about the course. They were real troopers. They banded together and helped each other, the students with like less experience leaning on the students with more experience. But there were a lot of challenges that came up. From the instructor's perspective, the first one was that there were just too many assignments. With the 3 prototypes, they had to do a proposal, the prototype itself, and a reflection or postmortem. There was also a synthesis paper at the end. This meant I was grading something nearly every week for every student. Didn't have the time to give as much feedback as I wanted to. Students lacked knowledge in game-specific domains. As Andy mentioned, my students, a lot of them lacked production experience, which I kind of knew going in. But what surprised me a lot was the lack of knowledge of game history itself. And of course, this made sense with students who may not have, be gamers in their own prior experiences. But even now, as we get older too, the students I had who maybe considered themselves gamers did not have the deep background that I would have expected, which led them to reinventing many wheels that had already come before. And I had set aside some time for playtesting within the class, but I had also expected the students to do this on their own. And surprise, surprise, they did not. You could clearly tell with the prototypes, the students who did from the students who didn't have time. And this was just due to time constraints that all students have. Just as an example of something that worked really well, Alex Custodio was a PhD student in our independent program at Concordia. They designed 2 prototypes, web and dot matrix stitch, that explored cross-stitching as a mechanic. And they wanted to explore the concepts of slowness and materiality and reflecting on games. These were designed specifically to appeal to non-gamers, and they play tested the games with people outside of, the class and outside of like gamer circles, which you could really see coming through. They were very long games. One game took 2 to 3 hours to play. Cross-stitch is not something you can speedrun. And this led to sort of this cozy discussion-based experience and really sort of challenged the hegemony of play that Fran and all have talked about at their manifesto, that we need to go beyond thinking of like the tenets of AAA games and the traditional genres and formats that we see. And just in terms of evaluating the work, I mentioned I wanted students to think through, how can you have a game that, conveys some kind of meaning or theme. I told students that failure did not mean, you know, they couldn't fail if the game didn't work, but like, what was failure and success to them in their project? This meant that grading was really hard. You know, I didn't want them to be evaluated necessarily on their game making skills because they weren't game making students, but it left me with questions as to what exactly I had to work with. And so a lot of it fell back on documentation. You know, how clearly were they defining their concepts and their goals and outlining, you know, their practices, but I was not totally satisfied with how this went.
So to jump in on course 2, you're going to see a lot of the same themes. So my course it's an interesting course because it's a making meaningful games class. But I chose to parse that in 2 different ways because it's also trying to prepare them for capstone. So we focused on making meaningful games and what a meaningful game was. And then we also focused on making games and sort of specifically what the design process is, what the development process is, what are the steps to necessarily produce something and get it out the door. And so we read deeply from Making Deep Games from Doris Ruch, but also coupled with a game production handbook from Heather Chandler, and then some augmented materials from Fullerton, from Jesse, from you know, sort of the usual suspects in terms of game design. And the whole syllabus is online at that link if you want to take a look at what we were trying to do and what the overall goals were. Very similar to Mia's experience. So the student preparation walking into that course varied wildly. So you had some people that had deep technical expertise. You had some students that had deep artistic expertise, some students that saw themselves as designers but had never really done a lot of design in this space. And just kind of a real mix of students, which is interesting and wonderful in lots of respects, but is also very difficult to deal with when you think about, you know, the capability for producing certain kinds of game artifacts. Students struggled with our reading and engagement of metaphor and abstraction as proposed in deep games, and also in terms of posing deep research questions and then evaluating their conveyance through games, which we'll talk about later. And again, the playtesting lacked structure, and what I found really interesting was that they would all use each other as playtesters, but there was sort of this invisible wall about going beyond outside the class. And so when you talk about whether or not these were successful in conveying research themes and findings, if you're only asking other people in the class, that's a pretty biased audience in terms of the feedback that you're going to get. As an example of one of the games that was produced there, one of my students, Hazel, produced a game called Lunch in Paradise. It's a menu order simulation game. So you have a little budget and you have to get lunch every day at this beautiful tropical beach. And over time, the menu becomes more and more expensive and more Americanized. And so there are fewer local things to choose from, and they cost you more, and you eventually go broke. And this whole thing is an allegory exploring the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. And there's a reveal at the end of some of the underlying history. But from an arts-based research perspective, we were trying to examine this question of whether or not a game can get you to feel the tension in a problem like that, more so than just explain the facts or how it works in a relationship like that. And so we were really looking at the emotional and cultural dissonance and how that was perceived by people that played it. So the evaluation of the course, I'm just going to say it was kind of a gigantic mess. All the students really loved the course, and they loved the course because there was an actual methodology proposed. So it was Doris and modified by me. We looked at, again, several examples of different people's processes in developing games and games for impact. But did we really make progress on games as research? And did we really achieve the goals that we were after? I'm less sure. And for that matter, I, like Mia, I think wound up falling back on documentation to make grading more objective and less subjective. But if you're actually evaluating the game artifact and its conveyance of research, maybe they should be more subjective. So there's some open questions there. And then I'll kick it back over to you to cover this part.
Sure. So one of the readings I had assigned was Nick Susanis' selections from his Unflattening, which was his dissertation that was written kind of graphic novel style. And he says that he was trying to bring words and images together for a simultaneous engagement of multiple vantage points from which to engender new ways of seeing. So he was basically arguing that, you know, we have the written text as scholars and it can make some points, many points that we want to make, but that there's another way to make an argument, you know, and for him it's through comics. And so that's why like his dissertation was sort of groundbreaking at the time for saying, yes, you can make arguments successfully, you know, through visuals in addition to through text. And so that's one of the themes that I was trying to convey, you know, through the course. Is there a way that games can do this also? But then there's the Kuttner et al. Asking the questions, can something be a bad comic but still be good research? If so, will anyone want to read it? Because, you know, we are, you know, these were students, they were still learning how to do research, they were learning how to make games, and then they were learning how to make, you know, like a meaningful game. This is a lot of learning. And, you know, the question was, can it fail, you know, in its artwork, but succeed in the message? Or, you know, are they tied together? And if they are, is this something that we could, you know, reasonably ask students to do? And we never fully answered this question, but it kept coming up, and I think it was a productive one to engage in. And just, I'm gonna just sum up quickly here and say that there was no, you know, I guess I went in thinking maybe there would be a perfect student for this, and there's no perfect student, as both of our courses showed. Students that had no background in game design, you know, took extra time to struggle with the tools or to learn about genre conventions to help them. But students with those backgrounds and genre conventions in games struggled sometimes to break free of them, right? And so in that way, they both came in with challenges to maybe see past or overcome. Andy?
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, in that duality between unflattening and then some of the criticism of unflattening, you know, there's really one of the arguments that unflattening makes is you know, he pushes the point of using the form of comics, using the form of the graphic novel as standing almost in not in opposition, but as a different model for how to convey research than a traditional monograph. And so one of our deep questions here is how do we embrace the gameness of games when we think about research creation, and what does that, how can we do a better job of that, and what does that mean? So I'm going to close by thanking my friend John Nordlinger, who co-founded FDG. I always think FDG is a wonderful space to be in, because it's one of very few conferences that gives us this space to really kind of post-mortem courses and talk about how we teach games and how to make the teaching of games better. So thank you, John. And with that, we'd be happy to take questions, comments, etc. And there's our contact information if you want to contact us after.
Awesome, thank you very much. I'm going to read a question that's in the chat from John Acock. If each of you could do only one thing differently with your course, what would it be?
I would, so I mentioned they had to do 3 prototypes and they could iterate on one. I would make them iterate on one and I might only do 2, but definitely if I kept it at 3, one of the 3 would have to be an iteration, because the students who did that were the most successful. They were the clear minority. Everybody had tons of ideas, but the students who spent more time building and reflecting, you could see it in the, you know, the success of what they were trying to convey.
Yeah, I think I probably erred a little too widely on, you can use any tool set that you're familiar with and you can make, you know, just about any kind of game that you want to make. And I think that if I had to do it again, I might, at least for the first prototype, narrow that so that everybody had more commonality of experience and could start using people as resources more. So, and keep it simple, right? So, you know, let's just make a, you know, slightly modified Twine game, or let's just make a, you know, small, you know, sort of like text and graphics sort sort of experience at first, because I think people got caught up in trying to use certain forms that they were already familiar with and then shove what they were trying to do into that. And I think I would rather, just choose a form and then let's explore deeply different ways to use that form in terms of research creation.
Cool, thank you. So Andy, you mentioned the desire to make grading more objective and less subjective. Why?
I guess I feel like, we always make that argument of sort of like, well, they're appealing to an audience, and to a certain extent, the audience is me or what have you. But I think when we talk about research and effective research, right, what we're really saying is, how well was that conveyed? What was the impact of that research? And we have all kinds of crazy, silly metrics about how to do that, and I disagree with most of them. But I think that is the right question, which is, how do we know that this was an impactful piece? And so we should be, measuring its impact on its desired audience. And I don't think we got there in the course that I offered. Right? We did some play testing and we did some analysis, and from a design perspective, they can say, oh, well, I made these design decisions and then they worked or they didn't work. But I think we want to push further on that to really know whether or not the experiences that we're creating are having the impact that we intended them to have.
Okay, because it sounds, I guess, as you were discussing the examples, part of me was saying, well, this looks like an art piece that an artist would create, and they have an intent behind it, and then they can ask themselves, well, I hope the audience gets out of my art what I'm trying to express. But on the other hand, I'm hearing the word research a lot, and I guess it seems like there's a bit of, I guess if you're thinking, look, these need to be meaningful and interesting, and hopefully can express something that the person on the other end can get, and if it's based on some real world research problem or question or issue.
Well, I think then that depends, Jose, on like when I was asking my students, what is success or failure for your piece? Because for some of them, it was a way to like elicit conversation or greater discussion amongst players about strategic voting in Canada.
Right.
But for others, was convey a feeling of ever-present surveillance, right? So and you may have to observe people, but they're different kinds of things that they were going for. Or they could say like, I want to create my sense of this. And so for them, like, it didn't matter what other people thought, it was what they thought.
Yeah, it sort of seems like on getting back to the grading, that spectrum of objective versus subjective is really squishy, as it were.
Yeah, squishy is a good word.
Yeah, we're pushing towards objective might be a bad idea. The same on the other side.
Right, because it's something that I've sort of constantly struggled with. I never want students to feel like it's just whether or not I liked your thing, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like, okay, so but what are the characteristics? What are the characteristics of the good ones, right? And so there has been, that's what I think we sort of meant about sort of to some extent having to fall back on documentation and other measures, right, as a proxy for really just examining the quality of the artifact that was produced itself, right? And again, when you're making prototypes, right, it's like, well, you're not using the polish, right? There's and so it's more about evaluating the ideas than the product. So it was just a very interesting approach. I'm excited to do it again, but I think it's going to take a lot of learning to get this where I would want it to be.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for sharing. I guess we do Tracy, let's do a round of applause for all the speakers and presenters. So I guess we can do a little, what is it, the reaction thingy. There we go. I think now we're supposed to move on to the demos on competition session in Zoom room number 1. So I need to run off and do some teaching, but thank you very much for coming to this session and enjoy the rest of FDG.
Thanks, Jose. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks for coming.